Welcome to the virtual rebroadcast of PubK's 2024 Government Contracts Annual Review. During this week, we are presenting 14 panel discussions featuring more than 70 expert practitioners, as well as 2 in-depth conversations with key government officials. PubK publishes news and insights for the government contracts community, such as PubK Protests and Claims, PubK Cybersecurity and Data Privacy, and PubK Compliance and Enforcement. In addition to our annual review, we also host webinars, podcasts, and in-person networking meetings during the year. If you'd like to learn more about PubK, visit us online at pubkgroup.com. All of this week's presentations were recorded live at our in-person conference in February at the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. You can join any or all of these sessions during the week using the same link and password you used today. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. Your video will remain disabled through the entire session. Many of our panelists are joining us today to answer questions about their presentations. Enter your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the panel will address as many as possible during the webinar. If time allows, we'll open up a live Q&A session after the video presentation. Our briefing book, which includes all of this week's slide presentations and other materials, are available for download from the PubK website. We are applying for continuing legal education CLE approval in Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and Kansas. While we cannot guarantee approval, we expect acceptance within the next few weeks. We will notify all attendees when those approvals have been received. If you received CLEs for our in-person event, you can apply for additional CLEs for panels that you may have missed. And finally, if you are interested in obtaining CLE, please look for our poll question during the presentation. The state boards require us to verify your participation during the event. The poll is a simple yes/no question. We will keep track of all responses to verify that you viewed the panel. If you do not wish to obtain CLE credit, you can disregard the poll. This conference would not have been possible without the strong support of our event sponsors, all of whom are listed on the next few slides. Our sponsors also provided speakers for our event and other valuable input. We encourage you to review the strengths and capabilities of these firms and to reach out to them directly with any questions you may have. And now we present our next panel, International Contracting.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us today. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I've severely admonished my co-panelists to stay within time. I've left a 30 seconds for myself at the end, so I may get to talk about environmental issues, but if I can't, don't. My single slide is at the back of the materials. We're very, very fortunate to be joined by our international colleagues. As I say, in every year of conferences of this type, I note that our program at GW Law School, and I'm Chris Eukins, has really grown internationally over the last 20 years. This year, for example, we have students from South Korea, from Pakistan, really spread around the globe. And a big part of that is the support we get from our colleagues around the world. We're joined by Micah Bowsher, KC, who is a lawyer at Moncton Chambers in London. He's a barrister there. KC means he's an elite barrister. He's one of those people who wears the horsehair wigs. It's a very, very cool job. And he is a leader in the UK procurement bar. We're very glad to have him. He's also a visiting professor at King's College London. Paul Lalonde is from Dentons in Canada. He works on some of the toughest cases in public procurement in Canada. We're very, very fortunate to have his input on what are key developments. We'll be talking to you about what are the key developments in internationally and in procurement in Canada. We're also joined by Roland Stein, who is from the Blomstein. He's the Stein in Blomstein. He's from the Blomstein firm, and it's a boutique public procurement firm in Berlin. They're cutting-edge lawyers in public procurement, including on defense procurement issues in Germany. We're very, very fortunate to have him. He and his partner, Pascal Frinton, regularly cooperate with us as we're working on developing the literature in this area. Andreas Sundstrand is a professor at Stockholm University in Sweden. She's very much the mother of the Swedish procurement bar. She has most of the Swedish procurement lawyers, there's about 300 of them, have been students of hers, and she has an annual conference every year in Stockholm. It's very cool. If you have a chance to go to that conference, the one thing I have to warn you about is the Swedish procurement lawyers dance. They actually have a dance, which I found absolutely terrifying as an American procurement lawyer, but it's a lot of fun. She's broadly admired by her former students, and she really serves as a mentor to many, many procurement lawyers across Sweden. It's a very cool example of how to grow a procurement bar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Bauscher, and he's going to talk to us about the developments in UK procurement law.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here again. That's me. Let's get rid of that photograph. You don't want to do two lots of me at the same time. It's really too much. I am going to talk about UK procurement reform. There are many other things I could talk about in UK development, but the big news is that we are about to put in place a new procurement law, which will come into force later this year. It's scheduled for October. I'm not sure if that's really going to happen with an upcoming election. Why are we doing it? What's the aim? Well, 8 years ago, it can't be that long ago, we had to live through the whole Brexit process, and the Brexiteer politicians were very keen to get rid of procurement law completely. One of their planks was that it was possible just to get rid of this nonsense because it was a pain in the neck. And they discovered they came up against reality after they'd won, and were told by the civil service that wasn't possible. So we have an interesting compromise where they've said, okay, well, we'll update it and simplify and organize it in a way that looks more British, but we have to do it in a way that recognizes our obligations under the EU exit arrangements, under the WTO government procurement agreement, under all the various trade agreements, etc., etc. And what a surprise, we end up with a beast which looks remarkably recognizable as an EU procurement law, but with lots of words which are subtly different, which is really good news, because I've only got 10 or 15 years left of doing this, and it would be really a pity if I had to argue about the same questions again. So now I get to argue all the same things, but with different words. So it's given me a sort of new lease of life. And I'm writing a textbook on all of this, which was really a silly thing to do, but I've been told that I wouldn't want anyone else to write it, so I'm motivated by spite for the rest of this year writing this damn book. So what are we talking about? The suite of measures. We have something called the Procurement Act. It is supposed to coalesce all the procurement law from all the various different EU regimes. Those of you familiar with the EU regimes will know that they come in different tranches over different sectors. We now have it in one act, except the fun is the simplicity is rather taken away by the fact that every other section says that this section doesn't apply to this sort of person. So we've put it all in one place, but then said it isn't actually applicable. So hey ho. There's then loads and loads of subsidiary material. The regime will not apply to Scottish government arrangements, and there are various other things which have been recently in the last few weeks updated in the health and transport sector, and also our defence single source regime will also be reformed this year. So by this time next year, in any event, we should have a procurement regime which is more or less comprehensive, which will be completely new and separate, at least legally, from the current EU-based system. Key changes, I'm not going to try and cover them all, but here are some of the key ones. I'll come back to objectives. We've got rid of all the various EU procedures. We don't have all the competitive dialogue and so on and so forth. We just have an open procedure, and something called competitive flexible, which means you make it up as you go along. Each one you decide what your procedure is going to be, which is great if you're a big central government department buying nuclear submarines and you've got the time and the resources to come up with the perfect procedure. It's going to be a real pain for small local authorities that don't have the enormous resources and are having to reinvent the wheel. There's clearly going to have to be a lot of standard guidance setting out sort of standard procedures, because otherwise some of procurement is going to grind to a halt.
Can I just throw a quick thing in?
Yeah.
Just for the Americans, open procedure is what we would call sealed bidding.
Yes, sorry, yes. New bidder exclusion, we at last have a proper debarment, a centralised debarment system, or will have, with an expanded list of grounds for debarment challenge. So I think for the first time anywhere in Europe, we will have a fully functioning suspension and debarment process. Quite how that works with the courts, again, we'll have to see. We have a new process for direct awards, which is really a function of COVID. Procurement wasn't always as great as it should have been, so we will now have a formal system where the government and the legislature will cooperate in designating a circumstance as an emergency justifying direct awards, and so there will be a degree of transparency which can be vetted through the legislature. And we have an enhanced transparency regime. One might say good thing, more transparency, better, for all sorts of reasons. A lot of authorities I speak to are very concerned that this, while this may be in itself a good thing, that they have not been provided with the resources to comply with the transparency regime. Some are making it fairly plain that they're just not going to do it because they don't have the resources at the moment, post-COVID and so on and so forth. Some are tooling up with larger departments to do it. We now have, in place of the previous EU law principles, we now have a number of objectives, some of which are just remapping EU law. So we have, I've called it transparency. It doesn't actually use the word. It's in part consistent with the rest of the legislation. We've used lots and lots and lots of words to say transparency without using the word. We've done the same thing with equal treatment. We've used lots and lots of words to avoid using the word equal treatment. But we have these new provisions saying that one of the objectives include delivering value for money. Fair enough. Maximising public benefit, that is already being relied upon by some authorities, or some authorities are saying they're going to rely upon this for all sorts of reasons, which would clearly not be consistent with the GPA. So I think there's going to be quite a battleground as to how far maximising public benefit means maximising local public benefit, etc., etc. I don't need to explain where that might go. And then we have a whole section about favouring SME policy, which is an interesting reflection. We've actually had this in place, a pro-SME policy for over 10 years, in part inspired by interactions with Professor Eukins with government 10 years ago, where he told them what to do and they ignored him, and they went and did something else and it didn't work, so they're going to give it another go. We'll see. But
just again, translation, SME is small, medium-sized
sorry,
enterprise.
yes,
So our small businesses.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm countering. I've only got 2 minutes. Uncertainties, loads and loads of them. I'm not going to cover them all, but we have the biggest change, I think, is that we now have a contract performance regime built into our Procurement Act. We never had that as part of the EU law, so all big contracts above about £5 million will have to have KPIs written into them. Failure to meet the KPIs will be reported upon every year, and potentially become a grounds for default and debarment. You're familiar with that, the outlines of a concept like that here, and it seems normal to you. It's completely novel in our system, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And then, crucially, a lot of the stuff which is important comes through our National Procurement Policy Statement. We actually have 4 of them, one for Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, and they're all subtly different. But this is where we get social value and environmental benefit coming in, and you'll see that the requirement is to take account of social welfare and environmental benefits in setting your award criteria and so on and so forth. Now, again, how enforceable that will be, how far civil society bodies will be able to attack authorities that fail to load up sufficient social value into their model, we'll see. But, I mean, we already have an obligation on most central government authorities to apply 10% of the weighting in any award process to the social value issues. So we'll see how important that becomes. Problems. too many policies loaded into the procurement statement without any real clarity. All over the Act there's some badly written stuff about how decisions are going to be reviewed, a lack of court rules in place. We just don't know how a lot of this is going to work out. And surprising, maybe I'll just finish on this point, one of the surprising things is in all of this change, there is remarkable stability. One of the big things which is supposed to be symbolically significant is that we've changed the overall award criterion from most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. So what? It turns out it's almost no difference at all, because if you look, or if you, sorry, I thought I had it in, I must have skipped that slide. If you look at the definition of most advantageous tender, it's basically a recitation of the current EU law for most economically advantageous tender. So the real guts of the change will be in the policy that drives the criteria underlying it, rather than anything else. Big issues, there are many. The real question will be what to get ready now. Government is trying to educate procurers. I think it's not moving fast enough. The real issue going forward will be planning for bidders, and I think the takeaway for people in the private sector bidding to the UK is sort out your defaults now, because when we have the new development process in place in 10 months' time, your previous sins will come back to haunt you. So now is the time to work out where the skeletons are and how you're going to explain them to avoid debarment in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to pass it on, Paul? Just to quickly explain the last point. So presumptively, unlike our system, presumptively the past performance information for contractors would be publicly available. So Michael says the contractors have to clean house. It's in anticipation of the past performance information being part of a public file. Paul?
All right, I'm on. Thank you very much, Pub K Law, for allowing us to put on this little show again this year, and thanks, Chris, once again for being the maestro, pulling this little band together. We've been doing this now for several years, and it's, for me, always a highlight at the beginning of the year, and thanks again for allowing me to participate. It's a real pleasure. So I'm going to talk about what's going on in Canada very briefly. I'm going to try to finish at 55. We're at 47. It's a lot of ground to cover. It's a big country, lots going on. I'm going to talk very briefly about some high-level trends and give you a bit of an overview, super briefly about what's happening in defense procurement, but the slides are there and you'll have a couple of things there to bring home. I want to talk about development, and I'd be really interested in the reaction I'm going to get when I talk about this in terms of whether anything sounds familiar or is comparable in the U.S. Agile procurement, the agile procurement strategy, which is anything but agile in my view, but in any event, I'll talk a bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about an update on a really fascinating case that was initially decided in 2022 that I spoke about at this panel last year, and the Court of Appeal recently rendered a decision on that case, so I wanted to touch upon that. So at a high level, how's it going in Canada? Well, pretty good. Unemployment's low, the economy's growing, budget deficits, and the debt is comparatively, compared to our G7 peers, pretty good, pretty healthy balance sheets for most of the governments, so they have money to spend on their priorities. So it's a good place to be pursuing government contracting opportunities. The money is there, and it's being spent pretty freely, comparatively speaking. Some of the big focuses for governments are predictably AI, cybersecurity, and privacy. A lot of major IT projects in those areas. Governments are pursuing a number of priorities in this spending. Green procurement is a big deal. Happy to talk about that more if it's of particular interest to anybody, but we now have GHG gas emissions reduction commitments baked into evaluation criteria in Government of Canada procurements, and it's a big struggle for companies to respond to that. Major push, particularly on the diversity side, on Indigenous procurement. First Nations businesses being spending on Indigenous businesses becoming a huge priority. If you're coming to Canada If you can partner with an indigenous business in your area, you're going to do well. It's the big advantage to working with First Nations businesses. A lot of spending on what we call our housing crisis. We've had a lot of population growth, primarily driven by immigration. So in the area of housing and related infrastructure, massive spending going on and lots of opportunities. And the bad news is a lot of local content requirements are creeping back into the conversation. There's been talk of that already, especially at the local government level. There's a lot of that stuff. On defense procurement, just 30 seconds on this. If anybody wants to talk about it more, I'm happy to afterwards. Canada has been proclaiming its commitment to 2% of GDP as defense spending. It's repeated that commitment many times to its NATO partners, and it's very earnest about meeting that 2%, except it's not even coming close. Again, this year, our GDP is up, and our defense spending was cut by $1 billion. So in the grand scheme of things, billion's not a lot, but we should be going in the other direction to meet the commitment. So that's the bad news. The good news for suppliers is we have a massive load of aging infrastructure and equipment that's rusting out and that needs to be replaced. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for big capital projects. And there have been a few that have been successful. Boeing got recently a very big contract, multi-billion-dollar contract for the Poseidon aircraft. And there's a lot of other projects going on. Happy to talk about those to anybody who's interested particularly. So agile procurement. I'm down to 4 minutes. I'm going to do my best. So agile procurement's a strategy that was adopted a few years ago by the Government of Canada. It's not a completely new or novel idea. You see it in a few other countries. Some of the provinces have toyed with this stuff. But it aims to achieve business outcomes through collaboration and dialogue with suppliers and end users. So it's viewed as an iterative procurement process rather than the classic, we define the requirements, issue a tender, and wait for bids to come in. So they tend to take a bit longer, and they tend to involve a lot more back and forth between industry and the purchasing authority. So far under this so-called agile procurement strategy that's been focused so far on major IT solutions procurement, there's been about $6.6 billion spent by the Government of Canada. It's not nothing. It's a good body of experience so far. And what does that experience tell us? Well, the Auditor General of Canada recently issued a report this past fall on the agile procurement strategy. It put in a very handy visual comparing, and I'm not going to take you through it line by line, you'll be glad to know, a very handy visual comparing sort of classic tendering process versus agile procurement. If you're interested to dig into the details, it's in the slides, and I invite you to have a look. The link to the report, which is quite interesting for procurement professionals as well, is in the slides. The Auditor General expressed some concerns. They're all listed there, primarily having to do with the capability of the purchasing side, of the purchasing authorities, and not having the necessary skills, training, et cetera, to do agile procurement in an agile fashion. For suppliers, what does it mean? I've helped a lot of suppliers through a number of these projects, and what it translates into is more work. It involves, sustained engagement over time in a process. It's not just, you pull together the best possible proposal, you get it done, you file it on time, and then, you wait for a decision and get on with your life. These are processes that grind on for months, sometimes well over a year. And a lot of back and forth, a lot of correspondence, a lot of reviewing and re-reviewing documents that are issued by the procuring authority. A lot of things tend to come to light in those exchanges, and a lot of difficulties emerge with lack of clarity and lack of clear response to questions from purchasing authorities. Again, happy to talk about it in more detail if anybody's curious about the experience. My view is that the purpose of it is to be more agile, more efficient, quicker, et cetera. It's none of those things. It's a lot more challenging, a lot more difficult for the purchasing authorities. So now I'm into overtime, injury time, and getting to my last topic, the Thales case. In its simplest expression, the Thales case in Canada involved local content requirements, and a judicial review filed by Thales seeking to quash the issued tender documents on the basis that they violated the no local content requirements of the Canada-Europe Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. And in first instance, to everyone's surprise, the court agreed that the fact that a local content that violated the treaty was included in the tender documents was sufficient for the court to intervene to determine that that was an unreasonable administrative act that could be reversed by the court. Pretty shocking development to us procurement nerds in Canada. Everyone was pretty surprised, but excited at the same time that we were in this new world of treaty implementation or direct treaty application in domestic law. So that was the divisional court decision in 2022. Court of Appeal decision came out just a little over a month ago, December 29, and it reversed the divisional court decision, the initial decision. The appeal was allowed, the application was dismissed, and the court determined that the divisional court erred. Interestingly, the court had a much more classic approach. The Court of Appeal had a much more classic approach. It emphasized that WTO decisions and other treaty decisions are not binding on domestic courts, and said that disputes about compliance with treaties belong in treaty dispute resolution mechanisms, not in the courts. I'm going to stop there because I'm past my time, but it's a fascinating case, one of the most interesting I've seen in my career in public procurement law in Canada. Would love to talk for hours about it with anybody who's interested. I'll be around. So, Andrea?
Actually, it goes to
Thank you. Thank you, Chris and PubK and my dear co-panelists for having me here. I'm going to be talking about the foreign subsidies regulation, which is basically a law story between government contracts, merger law, international trade law. So I think all these legal areas come together to make a new animal of EU law, which I think the story it tries to deal with is one of the first cases I worked on was the constant dispute between Airbus and Boeing on who's getting more money and who's being more penalized. I think this was way back, and the governments then tried to settle that over the WTO. The WTO now being as it is, it's been more difficult to deal with that at that level. So I think if you look at EU law first, the basic concept is state aid, which means that if you're an EU member state, you're not allowed to simply, pour money into companies. So if you want to give one company money, be it in the form of a subsidy, be it in the form of a tax cut, you need to have a certain procedure, and you need to apply for a clearance with the European Commission if certain conditions are met. So that's to allow a level playing field in the entire EU, to avoid distortions of competition by, national champions being built up. And the problem is this state aid concept only works within the EU, and it doesn't apply for foreign subsidies that in case, a company receives a foreign subsidy, the idea is that it will be entering the EU market with an unfair advantage. And I think the main example that is given, and I think that's an example that probably would also be well heard here in Washington, are the Chinese subsidies. Chinese government pumping billions into SOEs. That's seen as an unfair advantage when Chinese companies then enter the EU. But the other case, and that's why I think it's relevant to discuss that here, That's Ms. Verstager. It's an influential politician at the European Commission. And she's, you don't have to read the entire text, but basically she's saying that this also applies, for example, to the Inflation Reduction Act being imposed here in the US. So that doesn't mean that, US companies that will be active in the EU will be prohibited from participating in public procurement procedures there, but there is a procedure to be followed, and this may cause quite some headache in future. In future meaning as of now, because the rules started to apply in October of last year. So how does the procedure look in practice? There are 3 pillars. The first one deals with M&A or with joint venture issues. So if there is a concentration, as it is called, between a foreign or also between EU and EU companies, and one of the entities has a turnover of 500 million euros in the fiscal year before that acquisition, and in case of financial contribution of both parties is above 50 million euros in one of the last 3 preceding years, then there is an obligation to notify the European Commission. So I think we're talking about, a turnover of over 500 million euros. That's something, right? So we won't be talking about huge number of cases, but still some cases will be there. Perhaps the M&A activity will start eventually. So then this will play a major role. The second pillar deals with, the core public procurement cases. And also here we have 2 core requirements. The first is that we have a public procurement procedure of over 250 million euros. So that's also large procedures. So I think if you look, I don't know how many procedures this will be every year, but not a huge amount. But in the public transport sector, large infrastructure projects, I think sometimes that the threshold is easily met. And in this case, the requirement for the ex ante obligation to apply is that either the bidder or the main suppliers have a financial contribution, so a state aid, of over 4 million euros in any country outside of the EU. So, and I think there we start to realize where the issue is. Normally you don't know how many subsidies you get, in each state. So do you know if your subsidiary in Bangladesh received a COVID, subsidy to get along the way, of your UK sister received an R&D, tax assistance. So I think all these cases will then play a role into assessing the financial contribution, and that not only applies to the bidder, but as I said, also to the main suppliers of that bid. So that can be quite a number crunching issue. And the last tool available to the European Commission is, in case we're not in one of these 2 areas, is to have an ex officio investigation, meaning that the Commission can look into any case it really wants to see if there is a distortion of competition by foreign subsidies. That's a procedure that we, for instance, already started, so we didn't go directly to the Commission for various reasons. But we asked the German ministry to ask the Commission to start one of these procedures because it was a politically sensitive issue. But I think companies are realizing, if I have the impression that my competitor is doing something wrong because he's receiving money for something that he shouldn't be receiving money to, so that's a way for the Commission to get into the business and review the matters. The notification requirements, and I think that's why also EU companies are complaining heavily about these rules. They're extreme amount of red tape. You just have to gather the information, and I think that's easy if you're a utility company active in one country. Well, even then it can be quite complicated to assess what is a financial contribution because the rules are so different from country to country. But if you look at it from a group perspective, that's a nightmare. So imagine if you're a PE and you have 100 companies which have 200 subsidiaries, so trying to assess what information you need, that can be quite challenging, and you need to deal with that naturally before you enter into the public procurement procedure or into the M&A activity, because if you only start gathering the numbers when you're on the project, then the project is over and you don't even have the numbers, right? So I think that's really the challenge that you have in this regard. So what we keep on telling is that, you know, companies should put the numbers together, should prepare for that case that such a procurement procedure takes part, so that to be well prepared before the project really starts. And I think one possibility is, in case of doubts, and if the companies think that they will be participating in such large infrastructure projects, for example, that they have a discussion with the European Commission before the procedure starts, right? To say, okay, these are our numbers, do they look okay to you? You know, there are a number of service providers already which are crunching the numbers. I think to have a clear understanding is really key to deal with that matter properly. And I think that's it. I made up 2 minutes.
Thank you. Should I go? Sorry. So, thank you, Chris, and everybody else for inviting me. I've been on this panel now since 2016, and I keep coming back, so I'm very happy about that. I'm going to talk very shortly also about an emerging problem in the EU with public procurement. In the beginning, I've been working with public procurement provisions and regulations and directives since '93. Sweden implemented these directives, the EU public procurement directives, in '94. And way back then, actually, the Commission told us that selection and award criteria must have a strong connection to the subject matter of the procurement. And in these cases, it was doubtful if it at all was allowed to take environmental considerations, and social considerations was probably not possible to have in public procurements because there was not a sufficient connection to the object of the subject matter of the procurement. There was also statements from the Commission that these requirements could be a hindrance to the free movement of goods and services within the EU. So in the first law in Sweden, we actually more or less it was forbidden to take social, environmental, and labor law considerations, which today seems absolutely bonkers. But at that time, we were very good, a good member state listening to the Commission. However, this has changed a lot, mainly because of case law from the European Commission, from the European Court of Justice, who has really moved forward saying, yes, we can have these social criteria, we can have environmental criteria, we can have labor law criteria, but we can't have them anyway. They have to be proportionate, they have to be linked to the subject matter of the contract, and so on. So there are still limitations. So if I'm buying, for example, 10 IT consultants, I can't demand that half of the persons on the board must be women, because that wouldn't be connected to the 10 consultants I'm buying. But I could ask for half of those 10 consultants to be women and half men, for example. So the big step today from the 90s can be seen in the latest directive from 2014, in the recital, where, I'm not going to read all of this, but where it actually says that more or less nowadays we must, or shall at least, or it's good if we actually take these kind of considerations in public procurement to support common goals of social interests. And the European Court of Justice has also several times referred back to Articles 7 to 13 of the Treaty of the European, or the functioning of the European Union, because there you find the political goals of the EU, where it is like equal treatment of men and women, we should treat animals equally, good in a good way, I mean. We should take care of the environment, and so on and so on. So all the social issues are actually in those paragraphs, those articles, and the European Court of Justice keeps saying that those social goals and so on, and those articles are to be applied to everything we do in the EU, including public procurement. However, lately, there has been several new, I think I've counted more like 15 different directives, regulations, and so on, coming out from the EU, both as suggestions and actually also already adopted, that are saying that, and by the way, this also applies to public procurement, where it's mandatory. For instance, we have, when it comes to, let me see the next slide. Some example, we have a proposal for a regulation on deforestation. And in this proposal, it actually says that a supplier who violates this regulation must be excluded from public procurement. It's the same with the proposal for a directive on green claims. We have a proposal for a directive on the protection of the environment through criminal law. Again, a supplier who violates this must be excluded from a public procurement. We also have an example, actually, that I'm doing a work right now for the Swedish government looking into how this article affects public procurement, because we have an adopted directive on equal pay for women and men, equal pay for equal work. And in an Article 24.2 there, it says that member states shall consider requiring contracting authorities to introduce, and so on. So what does this actually mean? Are we obliged to do that or not? And the problem with these provisions, and I said these are just a few examples, is that if you look at the procurement directives, there is no possibility whatsoever, even if a supplier is convicted of slavery, it's not possible to exclude that supplier from a public procurement without that supplier first having a chance to comment on the decision to exclude him or her. There also is a possibility we have had since 2014 directives of self-cleaning, meaning that a supplier who actually fulfills certain criteria, even though they are convicted of slavery, can still participate, have the right to participate even. And we also have time limits. So for obligatory exclusion clauses, we have a 5-year limit. After that, it's not possible for a contracting authority to refer to these anymore. When it's voluntary or non-obligatory, there is a 3-year limit. None of this is even mentioned in all of these other directives and provisions or regulations. So we don't know. So if someone has been defying the deforestation regulation, do they have the right to self-cleaning? Do they have the right to have a 5-year limit? We don't know. So this is a big, big problem that has arisen the last years in Europe and for all the EU countries. This is a major problem. And it's just now actually started to be recognized. How can a small, as we are talking about big procurements, but how can a small procurement authority, contracting authority in the middle of Sweden even know about all of these different provisions and regulations? So this is a big problem all over Europe. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Could you just flip forward to my quick slide?
Yes.
So I'm going to close out. Just got a couple minutes. So the United States is arguing with regards to green procurement. The United States and the Biden administration, we're arguably in the lead worldwide. The United States is taking the most concrete measures towards green procurement. And you see the array there, what the Biden administration has done on the lower half of the slide. The first one that's bolded is a first step towards what's really the brass ring. The goal ultimately will be to allow contracting officials to weigh the carbon gas emissions that are attributable to a specific good or service, to weigh them in the evaluation process. To get there, the Biden administration has who required contractors generally above $50 million to chronicle the carbon gas emissions the greenhouse gas emissions that are attributable to the goods and services. The Congress, however, the National Defense Authorization Act, the most recent one, for fiscal year 24, Congress blocked that. So we're in the lead internationally, but Congress has blocked it with regards to defense procurement, which obviously is a huge portion of what we do in federal procurement. So that blocking in the National Defense Authorization Act is a major step sideways in terms of what the United States is doing in terms of sustainable procurement. Of course, if President Trump is elected, or former President Trump is elected, if he's elected in the coming election, we're likely to move sideways for a few years after that. So this is in a very shorthand way, this is where we are in green procurement internationally. We're arguably in the lead right now, but the National Defense Authorization Act has stalled a very important element of that. Just quickly, this afternoon, Professor Sundstrand will be presenting on defense procurement in the EU. If you'd like to join us, she'll be presenting in Stockton 306 at the law school, at GW Law School, just down the street at 20th and H. Again, it's Stockton 306, and information on that presentation is available on the blog Public Procurement International. We are exactly 1 minute over, so I'm going to close out here. Thank you very much.
Okay. So perhaps the end of a longish day, there aren't a great deal of large number of questions, and so I don't necessarily want to hold you for longer than is necessary. There's been an awful lot of information in that package of talks. I was just going to maybe just to give you a moment to think of the devastating question you wanted me to cover, and I more or less I can cover all the jurisdictions that were being discussed, except perhaps Canada, although I know a little bit about that. But so do fire away any questions on EU or UK law in the next few seconds if you have them. My observation is just to update the presentation by Roland Stein about the foreign subsidies regulation, and perhaps really confirming what he said. Since that talk was taped in February, we have had the first foreign subsidies regulation case being initiated by the EU Commission, or at least the first that has been publicly publicized, and that is indeed involving China. It is a case concerning contracts awarded or intended to be awarded to a Chinese railway company, CRRC, Qingdao Xifang Locomotive Company, with regard to a railway. It's for the provision of rolling stock and related parts in Bulgaria. And it's perhaps not surprising. I mean, this is, one might think, almost exactly the sort of case that politically it was intended this regulation should deal with. It is part of the general trend towards raising the fortifications around the EU market. All we have so far in terms of information about that case is the short publication of the summary notice by the Commission of the EU, which invites comments and notifies the market, the world and the market, that the case is ongoing and that comments are invited. What is perhaps, there's not a great deal of content in the notice, but the one point to draw out, which is in the regulation, but it's quite stark to see it written out, as it were, that the Chinese entity is really put to the task of having to prove that its contracts with the Chinese government were awarded on the basis of a competitive process. in competitive market conditions, which is quite a radical thing, sort of imposition to place on a tenderer in any public procurement, to say, well, you've been getting contracts elsewhere. If I'm to entertain you as a bidder, you have to be able to prove to me that your previous contracts with others, or others from particular countries, were secured in competitive conditions. And it'd be interesting to see how that is, how that's dealt with. But it does seem like quite a stark reversal of the normal burden of proof in cases like this. And it's perhaps, although it's, as I say, a Chinese case, it's a lesson which those of us in the US and now in the UK who have to have regard to this regime when we're advising entities tendering into the EU, we need to think through the practicalities of some of these points, and particularly this issue around how our clients are going to show that they were indeed securing contracts on the basis of a competitive process. That was the sort of update point I was going to make, and then maybe one other just general overarching observation. And the group that you saw before you is a team. We've been doing, some of us have been doing that panel, I think, in Washington in February for well over 10 years. I can remember. I haven't checked when we started. It is interesting to look back over time how radically the law has changed, and what we're now seeing in the last year or so is this really quite radical switch of direction from procurement laws, which hitherto were very much market-based measures, very much looking to value and market and market delivery. These are being sort of twisted or changed in their content by new policies around local benefit, social benefit, environmental benefit. The question has just been put in: is the FSR limited to specific procurements, or will it cover industries such as subsidized ship construction? It is, the FSR is not limited to any specific procurements. It is simply a value level. If you go back and look at, I actually worked out about when it came into force. I did a blog about it. It must be beginning of 2023. If you go back to the blog, which is referenced on my slides, you'll find my blog about then. And I went and did some hunting around to work out how many contracts a year in the EU that involved. I think given the value level, I reckoned it was about 250, 300 contracts a year, but it's certainly not limited to any particular sector. The only sector that I think one would expect might fall outside the regulation would be some core single-use military procurements. But I mean, even again, I would that probably doesn't rise even there, because for a couple of reasons, not least because the Commission has pushed back the extent to which you can avoid, member states can avoid the application of EU law just because defence is relevant. And in any event, I imagine that there will be there'll be a range of other agreements and so forth in place covering those sorts of defence arrangements. Ship construction is an interesting area where different member states have taken different views at different times about whether or not EU procurement law applies or not. Germany, for example, has generally tended to put them out to bid, whereas France and the UK have not. But that's usually been a concern around protecting a domestic naval shipbuilding capability, which has been less of an issue in Germany than it is in France and Britain. But generally speaking, the FSR is unlimited and applies to any public or utility procurements, at least insofar as those utilities are covered by the by the relevant procurement regime. I have probably worn everyone out, unless there's another question. I suspect that it's appropriate to stop there. Bill, are you happy with that?
Yes, Michael, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, both during the session and for this post-recording Q&A. We appreciate you and hope everybody got a lot out of the session today. We'll give you a few minutes back in your day and wrap this up. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join some more sessions during the rest of the week. Again, thank you, Michael, and thank you to our attendees.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists for their presentations and live Q&A. And again, special thanks to our sponsors whose support made this event possible.